Edessa had been the first Crusader city taken, and now it was the first to fall. The county of Edessa fell to a siege that was swift, brutal, and final, and at the hands of Imad al-Din Zengi. The city's fall shattered more than walls. It shattered the illusion that the Holy Land would remain forever in Christian hands. Then, a new leader rose. Not as ruthless as Zengi, but devout, pious, and deliberate. His son, Nur al-Din. The Second Crusade was coming. But this time, the cross would face something more dangerous than armies: unity. The snow had scarcely melted from the rubble of Edessa when the thunder of history shifted. The year was 1144, and the bloodied stones of that once proud Crusader city bore witness to a collapse that no Latin Christian had dared imagine. A Crusader stronghold, fallen, its garrisons slain or captured, its churches turned silent, and its people scattered or enslaved beneath the crescent flag. For the first time since the triumph of the First Crusade, Christendom tasted the bitter draught of loss in the East. Edessa had not been a grand city like Jerusalem or Antioch, but it had been the first, the foothold that opened the gates of Syria to Christian warriors. And now it was gone. News traveled slowly but not softly. In a world where parchment rode on horseback and rumors carried the weight of gospel, the tale of Edessa's fall spread like an infection. By the time winter had seized Rome, papal chambers stirred with dread. In early 1145, a report from the embattled Levant reached the ears of Pope Eugenius III. The city of Edessa, the oldest of the Crusader possessions, was gone, overrun by the forces of Imad al-Din Zengi, Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. To the Pope, this was not merely a territorial loss. It was an affront to divine order, a stain upon the sacred legacy of the First Crusade. The Holy Land had once seemed within reach of complete Christian domination. Now, a darker tide had turned. Within weeks, Eugenius issued a solemn papal bull, Quantum Predecessores. It was a direct echo of Urban II's clarion call at Clermont half a century earlier, and it held nothing back. It called upon the faithful not merely to take up arms, but to redeem the failure through holy sacrifice. This was not a defensive measure. It was an invitation to restore heaven's justice by the sword. A second crusade was born. But the Europe of 1145 was no longer the hopeful, volatile realm of 1095. It was a continent of crowns, of kings, emperors, and feudal inertia. The First Crusade had been led by ambitious nobles. This new one would be led by kings. The first to rise was the King of France. Louis VII, lean, ascetic, and deeply pious, received the news of Edessa's fall not with surprise, but with dread, and perhaps a measure of guilt. He had already been considering a pilgrimage to the east to atone for the burning of a church during a dispute with one of his vassals. The disaster in Edessa gave his desires a divine justification. Here was a sin greater than his own, one he could help redeem. Yet Louis was not a seasoned warrior. He ruled as a man of conscience more than command. His court was divided, his barons reluctant, his advisors skeptical. But Louis saw the crusade not only as a righteous cause. It was personal penance. He would offer his crown to the cross and his sword to the Holy Sepulchre. Still, the voice that would awaken the soul of Europe was not his. That voice came from Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian monk whose austere presence and commanding rhetoric had already reshaped the church, emerged as the soul of the Second Crusade. Tall, thin, gaunt-eyed, he spoke as if the breath of heaven had taken residence in his lungs. Where Eugenius issued the command, Bernard forged the flame. His sermons burned with urgency and apocalyptic consequence. The fall of Edessa, he preached, was not merely a military failure. It was divine punishment for the sins of Christendom. Only a new crusade, born of repentance and sacrifice, could cleanse the stain. He toured France with fire in his words. He thundered in churches, on steps, in city squares, and the results were miraculous. Nobles fell to their knees. Peasants wept. Entire villages took the cross. Crusading fevers spread like wildfire even to the Iberian Peninsula and the Rhineland. From the pulpits of Christendom, the crusade surged to life. Yet while faith stirred the hearts of the many, power moved the minds of the few. To Louis's east, another monarch watched from a colder, harsher court. Conrad III of Germany, king of the Romans, and overlord of the Holy Roman Empire, had reasons to hesitate. His reign had been troubled by dynastic rivalries and regional unrest. He was no stranger to war, but neither was he eager for another one across distant deserts. And yet the spiritual tide swept even emperors into its grasp. Persuaded by Bernard, and perhaps by the thought of sharing in Louis's glory, Conrad too took the cross in late 1146. Thus, for the first time, a crusade would march not under minor lords or free captains, but beneath the banners of crowned monarchs. France and Germany united by oath and symbol, bound for Jerusalem. But even kings would not march alone. In every village and royal court, one name was whispered as both legend and warning: the Knights Templar. By 1145, they had become more than a monastic military order. They were mythic. Founded to protect pilgrims in the wake of the First Crusade, they had evolved into the sharpest sword in Christendom's arsenal. Cloaked in white, bearing the red cross of martyrdom, they were warriors without wives, monks without cloisters. Bound by oath to poverty, obedience, and war, they had become the unbending backbone of Christian defense in the East. As the Second Crusade gathered strength, the Templars were both feared and revered. Their discipline stood in stark contrast to the bickering of kings. Their leadership in the Levant made them essential to any future success. Donations filled their treasuries. Volunteers joined their ranks. To some, they were saints. To others, zealots. But to the Latin Church, they were the embodiment of righteous war. The crusade would test not only their steel, but their legacy. Across the Levant, another change was underway. The man who had broken Edessa, Zengi, would not live to see the crusade he provoked. In September 1146, he was assassinated in his sleep by one of his own Frankish slaves. His death ended a career marked by both savagery and genius. But his legacy would not die with him. It would pass to his son, Nur al-Din. Inheriting Aleppo and Mosul, Nur al-Din was not merely a military leader. He was a visionary. Calm, calculating, and devout, he sought not just conquest, but reform. His father had ruled through fear. Nur al-Din would lead through discipline and law. Where Zengi roared, Nur al-Din moved with purpose. And he would prove to be the most capable Muslim ruler of his generation. The fall of Edessa had unleashed him. In the east, the Crusader states braced for war. In the west, the kings prepared to cross vast empires. But in the heart of every believer stirred something older than fear, something deeper than politics. A cause had returned, one baptized in memory, sanctified by blood. The cross had been summoned again. The echo of Edessa had become a storm. Spring winds stirred the banners of France and Germany in 1146, carrying with them not just the fragrance of renewal, but the weight of destiny. For the first time in history, kings, true crowned monarchs, would lead a crusade. Louis VII of France had already declared his intent, and his decision radiated across the courts of Europe like sunlight through stained glass. Pious to the bone, and burdened by guilt for his earlier sins, including the violent burning of a church at Vitry. Louis sought spiritual absolution not in monasteries, but on the battlefield. Edessa's fall was the divine summons he could not ignore. Yet beneath his religious devotion lay a man untested in war, swayed by advisers, and cautious in judgment. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, would accompany him, a queen in armor destined to complicate courtly allegiances and regional politics. Louis had zeal. What he lacked was control. To the east, the message of Bernard of Clairvaux had reached another monarch, Conrad III of Germany, the first Hohenstaufen king of the Romans. Initially reluctant, Conrad weighed the consequences of war far from his fractious realm. The Holy Roman Empire was no united domain. It was a web of quarrels, rival houses, and old resentments. But Bernard's fire reached even the icy peaks of imperial caution. In December 1146, at a great assembly in Speyer Cathedral, Conrad took the cross before a roaring crowd. The crusade had gained another crown and the burden of rivalry. Two kings would march, but they would not march as one. In distant Constantinople, a different crown watched warily. Emperor Manuel I, Komnenos, heir to the Byzantine legacy and ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, read the signs with concern. The fall of Edessa was no cause for joy. Zengi's power threatened his own frontier, but the arrival of thousands of Latin crusaders on his borders was no comfort either. Byzantium had learned from the First Crusade. Western pilgrims brought faith, but also arrogance. Some came to liberate the Holy Land. Others came to plunder. Manuel, a shrewd and charismatic ruler with ambitions of imperial restoration, understood the stakes. He welcomed the idea of a crusade, but on his terms. His strategy was one of cold logic. Treat the Crusaders as temporary allies to be managed, not partners to be trusted. His envoys moved ahead of the Western armies, offering guidance and warnings in equal measure. But suspicion poisoned every gesture. As Louis and Conrad prepared, they were already walking into diplomatic fog. Each king assumed leadership. Each wanted deference. Neither received it. Even Bernard of Clairvaux, the moral firebrand who had lit this holy war, struggled to mediate egos draped in ermine and silk. The route was clear. March east, through the Balkans, pass through Constantinople, cross Anatolia, and join the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem in retaking Edessa. But even the simplest plans falter under the weight of kingship. Conrad's army departed first in May 1147. Tens of thousands followed him. Germans, Austrians, Bohemians, bound by cross and oath. Yet almost immediately the journey revealed flaws. The march through Hungary and the Balkans drained resources. Relations with Byzantine governors were tense. When Conrad entered Constantinople, Manuel Komnenos greeted him with formality and frost. A pledge of allegiance was expected. Conrad refused. Worse still, when German troops crossed into Asia Minor, they ignored Byzantine advice. The emperor warned of Seljuk ambushes, treacherous terrain, and the need for strategic discipline. But the Germans advanced with medieval pride, heavy, slow, and overconfident. In October 1147, their column was swallowed in the hills near Dorylaeum, the very ground where the First Crusade had triumphed half a century before. But this time, the Turkish bow sang a different song. Arrows rained down in swarms. The Germans were crushed, their baggage abandoned. Survivors limped back to Nicaea and eventually to Constantinople, broken and bitter. Conrad's great crown had been dented before the real war even began. Louis VII's army followed behind. His passage through Byzantine lands was no less fraught. Byzantine governors demanded discipline. Louis's men answered with looting. Byzantine towns resisted. Crusader knights retaliated. By the time Louis reached Constantinople in October, Tension hung in the air like incense before a storm. Manuel Comnenus received him with diplomatic grace, but ensured that the French army crossed into Asia swiftly. He wanted them gone and safely contained. Louis, mindful of Conrad's fate, accepted Byzantine guidance. But in Anatolia, his army faced the same horrors. Turkish ambushes shredded his forces in the highlands near Laodicea. He himself narrowly escaped a skirmish by fleeing down a ravine. Supplies ran short. Morale plummeted. To make matters worse, Eleanor of Aquitaine's entourage became a political liability. Accusations of incompetence and betrayal spread like fire among the ranks. What had been a march of kings now became a test of survival. And yet, through the smoke and splinters, one order did not bend. The Knights Templar, with their strict discipline, intimate knowledge of the eastern frontiers, and spiritual fortitude, proved the exception. They provided structure where none existed. When Louis VII's army floundered in Anatolia, it was the Templars who took command of his vanguard and rearguard. Their ranks held, their discipline endured. While royal armies flailed in dust and blood, the Templars moved with method and mission. Founded decades earlier to defend pilgrims and the roads of Palestine, the order had grown into an elite force of warrior monks who balanced monastic piety with battlefield precision. Clad in white, armed with oaths and steel, they commanded fear from enemies and respect from allies. Their growing prestige did not go unnoticed. To many observers, it was the Templars, not the kings, who upheld the ideals of the Crusade. They fought not for crowns or titles, but for the faith itself. By early 1148, the remnants of Louis and Conrad's armies, weary and wounded, reached Antioch, and then Jerusalem. Their journey had become a pilgrimage of loss. Still, Edessa remained in enemy hands. The First Crusade had marched with faith, fire, and fractured leadership, and won. The Second had come with kings, crowns, and crosses, yet it had barely survived the road. Ahead lay one final hope, Damascus. But already beneath every banner waved a different will. Unity had worn thin. Trust had bled away. And the Byzantine alliance, once fragile, had all but shattered. Manuel Comnenus would not forget the insults and suspicion, nor would the West forget their defeats. When the dust settled over Asia Minor in early 1148, what remained of the proud crusading armies bore little resemblance to the glittering pageants that had marched east just months before. The banners of kings were still held high, but now they fluttered over torn ranks, hollowed eyes, and empty granaries. Conrad III of Germany, having seen the flower of his army shattered by Turkish ambushes outside Dorylaeum, had limped back to Constantinople. There, he accepted the aid of a man he did not trust, Emperor Manuel I Comnenus. Manuel offered ships to transport the survivors down the coast. Conrad had little choice but to accept. A campaign born in fervor had been broken by terrain, distance, and pride. But the true reckoning lay with Louis VII of France. Louis's army, following Conrad's path through Anatolia, had hoped to fare better. With Knights Templar officers now leading his columns, there was a degree of tactical order, at least more than the chaos Conrad's men had endured. Yet, the land showed no mercy. The Turkish Seljuks knew the mountain passes, the choke points, and the places where hunger struck hardest. The Battle of Mount Cadmus, in early 1148, became the defining humiliation. As Louis and his vanguard scaled a narrow ridge, they were separated from their supply train. Seljuk forces descended upon the disordered rearguard. French troops were slaughtered, scattered, or captured. Even Louis himself, clad in chainmail and astride a desperate mount, was nearly killed, defending himself with sword in hand before retreating through a ravine. By the time the survivors reached the coastal city of Anatolia, the French force was in ruins. There, another betrayal brewed. The Greek locals, exhausted by Crusader demands and fearful of Turkish retaliation, refused to aid the wounded. Louis was forced to abandon most of his infantry and wounded, to the mercy of hired ships, many of which never reached port. The king and a small contingent took to sea, eventually arriving in Antioch. What had begun as the journey of anointed kings now looked more like a march of shadows. And yet in Antioch, the stage changed. There, Louis VII was welcomed by Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch and uncle to Louis's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Raymond, a seasoned warrior and strategist, urged the king to abandon the now futile dream of retaking Edessa and instead turn the crusade northward, to Aleppo, the center of Nur al-Din's growing power. Raymond's proposal made military sense. Edessa was unrecoverable, Aleppo was vulnerable, and Raymond believed a swift strike could shift the balance. But Louis would not be swayed. Whether by piety, pride, or suspicion, he refused to be drawn into Antiochene politics. His wife, Eleanor, favored Raymond's plan. Some even whispered that her loyalty had strayed too close to her uncle's court. The rift grew. Tensions snapped. Louis left Antioch without his wife, ignoring Raymond's counsel and pressing on toward Jerusalem. In the Holy City, Queen Melisande and her son, King Baldwin III, received the battered kings. Melisande ruled as a lioness in court, widow of King Fulk and one of the most capable rulers in the Latin East. Baldwin, her son, was in his early 20s, newly crowned but already keen to assert himself as more than a prince-regent. Together they hosted the surviving leaders of the Crusade. In the sun-baked city of Jerusalem, a council was held. It was here in June 1148 that the Second Crusade made its final and most fateful decision. The debate was fierce. The goal of retaking Edessa was no longer feasible. It had been demolished, resettled, and fortified under Muslim control. Raymond of Poitiers' suggestion to strike Aleppo had lost momentum after Louis's refusal. What remained was a politically charged alternative: Damascus. The famed city stood as both a prize and a puzzle. Rich, ancient, and strategically central, Damascus had at times cooperated with the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Its ruler, Mu'in ad-Din Unur, had once been an ally against Zengi. But the political tides were shifting. Damascus now stood apart, neither fully friend nor full foe. And to many Crusaders, including Louis and Conrad, taking Damascus offered a symbolic success that Edessa could not. Baldwin III, though young, supported the plan. Perhaps he saw in Damascus the opportunity to assert Latin strength and quiet the growing doubt about the Crusader state's viability. The Templars, who had been instrumental in maintaining military cohesion so far, pledged their readiness. The decision was made. The march would go south. The crusade would strike at Damascus. But behind the decision, nothing was united. The German forces remained fractured. The French, embittered. The native Crusaders, cautious. Mu'in ad-Din Unur had eyes and ears throughout the region. He knew the Christians were coming. And in the north, Nur al-Din watched carefully, gauging how he might turn this campaign to his advantage. By July 1148, the armies of the Second Crusade, what remained of them, began their final march. They carried holy relics, battle standards, and fading hope. But they no longer carried trust. July 1148. The hills and orchards of Damascus shimmered beneath the blazing Syrian sun, as the Christian armies, what remained of them, emerged from the dusty roads with banners raised and drums pounding. The Second Crusade had found its final target, Damascus. Once an ally of the Latin kingdom, now a city viewed as a keystone for Christian victory, or at least Christian redemption. It had become the center of a calculated gamble. If Edessa could not be reclaimed, perhaps Damascus could be conquered. The political optics were irresistible. A major Muslim city, ancient and revered, taken in the name of Christ. Such a victory might salvage the humiliations suffered in Anatolia. But this was no longer the crusade of Urban II. This was a tired coalition of clashing wills. From the Christian perspective, the plan had appeal. King Baldwin III, young but ambitious, saw the siege as a means to cement his authority and demonstrate a continued strength of the Crusader states. The failures of Conrad III and Louis VII had left a vacuum, one Baldwin was eager to fill. The Knights Templar, true to form, stood ready for the assault. Their discipline had carried them through the horrors of Anatolia, and they now found themselves as the professional spine of an increasingly irregular army. They were not naive. Damascus was no soft target. But neither did they hesitate. The city itself was both inviting and perilous. It was surrounded by lush gardens and groves, its outskirts a fertile oasis fed by the Barada River. These gardens, though beautiful, presented both cover and complication. As the armies arrived, they launched their attack from the western side of the city, precisely where the orchards were densest and the defenses lightest. The Crusaders broke into the outer perimeter with startling speed, advancing through the thick vegetation and taking hold of irrigation towers, outposts, and defensive walls. Christian confidence soared. A major Muslim city had not been attacked this directly since Jerusalem itself. But Damascus was not unprepared. Within the city walls, Mu'in ad-Din Unur, the seasoned ruler of Damascus, gathered his forces and plotted his response. Unur was not a man of rash decisions. A diplomat and military commander of rare equilibrium, he had no illusions about the Crusaders' power. But he knew the terrain better than anyone, and more importantly, he understood politics. Unur had once worked with the Latin kingdom against Zengi, but Zengi was dead, and the tides were changing. Now, facing a siege, Unur acted with calm speed. He appealed not just to his own troops, but to his regional rivals, and to Nur al-Din, the rising emir of Aleppo. Though Damascus had long resisted absorption into Zengid control, necessity made unlikely partners. As the Crusaders pressed from the west, Unur sent word north. "Come now, or Damascus may fall." Nur al-Din answered. Back at the siege, disarray was creeping in. The Crusaders had broken into the groves, but not the city. Every day they remained in the orchard belt, their supply lines stretched thinner. Unur's men had fortified the inner wall, made quick raids into Crusader camps, and poisoned local wells. The Christians began to realize they had chosen the wrong side of the city to attack. So they made a fateful decision. They shifted their position to the eastern side, closer to the main wall, but with harsher terrain, fewer resources, and stronger defenses. The move sowed confusion. Morale dropped. The Templars held their line, but the rest of the army was wilting under the sun, hunger, and exhaustion. Inside Damascus, Unur prepared for a last stand, if it came to that. But it would not, for just as the Crusaders lost momentum, Nur al-Din's forces approached. The message was clear. Time had run out. Damascus would not fall. Then, without warning, without a final charge or heroic last battle, the Crusader coalition disintegrated. Distrust and politics consumed what unity remained. Western knights accused the Jerusalem nobility of treachery. Some claimed Baldwin had plotted with Unur. Others claimed the French and Germans refused to trust native Crusaders. The siege collapsed not with a sword, but with a whisper. On the fifth day, the Crusaders retreated. The fallout was immediate. Mu'in ad-Din Unur, victorious without surrendering the city, had bought time. The Crusaders, meanwhile, returned to Jerusalem in disgrace. Their final hope had failed. No victory, no redemption. Just a trail of empty promises and half-buried dead. The siege of Damascus had become the grave of the Second Crusade, and for Nur al-Din, it was the first true taste of victory. The crusade had ended, not with triumph, nor with tragedy, but with silence. When the battered armies of France and Germany departed the Levant in late 1148, they left no legacy of conquest. They left only questions. In Jerusalem, the streets did not ring with bells or hymns. There were no victory processions, no holy relics paraded through the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Only the grim faces of survivors told the tale. The kings who had set out with the authority of heaven had failed to reclaim even a stone of Edessa. Instead, they had fractured alliances, emptied treasuries, and tarnished the image of crusading glory. Louis VII of France, quiet and exhausted, sailed home through the ports of Antioch and Acre, his crown heavier than ever. He had come seeking atonement, but found only humiliation and suspicion. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose presence had stirred scandal and division, returned with him. But their marriage would never recover. Within a decade, it would end in annulment, sending Eleanor into the arms of another man, the future King of England, Henry II. Conrad III followed soon after, having witnessed the loss of his army in Anatolia and the collapse at Damascus. He had begun the crusade as an emperor of resolve, but would return as a ruler whose authority now carried the shadow of failure. And in the cloisters of Clairvaux, Bernard, once the blazing voice of divine will, was left to reckon with the weight of broken prophecy. He wrote letters filled with anguish and theological regret, blaming the failings not on God, but on the sins of men. But the world did not absolve him so easily. His authority had summoned kings to battle. His vision had collapsed in dust and dishonor. For the Latin West, the Second Crusade was not just a military failure, it was a spiritual one. But in the East, the embers of change had only begun to glow. Within the halls of Jerusalem, King Baldwin III emerged from the wreckage of the crusade with a new clarity. Baldwin was no zealot. He was pragmatic, educated, and aware of the deep fractures within the Crusader states. If Jerusalem was to survive, it would not be through reckless campaigns, but through consolidation, through leadership grounded in reality, not fantasy. By the early 1150s, Baldwin began asserting himself more directly, navigating the internal power struggle with his mother. Their eventual reconciliation would lead to a shared governance, with Baldwin increasingly taking the reins. His reign would be one of relative stability, diplomacy, and quiet strength. Though the crusade had failed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem endured, for now. And through it all, the Knights Templar stood unchanged. They had marched through Anatolia, they had held the lines at Damascus, and they had returned neither disgraced nor diminished. While the kings they protected faltered, the Templars had remained a symbol of constancy and resolve. In the minds of many, they were not the face of failure. They were the proof that holy war, when disciplined and focused, still held honor. Donations to the order did not slow. Their fortresses expanded. Their influence within the Latin East grew. Even as others fell, the Templars climbed, silent, cloaked, and absolute in purpose. The myth was no longer just myth. It was legend. But the real victor of the Second Crusade never raised a cross. He raised a crescent. Nur al-Din, the son of Zengi, the quiet reformer of Aleppo, had not fought the Crusaders directly at Damascus. He had watched, waited, and learned. When Mu'in ad-Din Unur had called for aid, Nur al-Din had responded, not with conquest, but with solidarity. And when the Crusaders fell back, Nur al-Din emerged not as a warlord, but as the new standard of unity. In 1154, just 6 years after the Crusades' collapse, Mu'in ad-Din died, and Nur al-Din claimed Damascus without resistance. The city opened its gates. No siege, no blood, just inevitability. With Aleppo and Damascus now under his banner, Nur al-Din became the most powerful Muslim leader in the region. More than that, he became the first real architect of Islamic unity in the face of the Crusader threat. He rebuilt mosques. He funded schools. He preached not vengeance, but justice. He was not finished, but he had begun. The Second Crusade had failed to reshape the world, but the world had reshaped itself in its wake. The Latin kingdoms had survived, but they had not grown. The West had come in thunder and departed in shame, and the East, fragmented, embattled, leaderless, had begun to bind itself together. The tide had not yet turned, but its direction was now clear. And in the silence that followed the retreat from Damascus, one truth rang louder than any sermon. The cross had faltered. The crescent was rising.
So, that's it for this episode. The Second Crusade ended not in glory, but in disgrace. 2 kings marched east and came home defeated. The Holy Land was unchanged, but the balance had started to shift. Thanks again for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you enjoyed it and want to help us keep making more medieval history documentaries. Next time, 3 legends will rise: a leper king, a Kurdish sultan, and a lion from across the sea. Their clash will shake the world. The Third Crusade is coming. We'll see you there.